to understand what did create the internet and what the nature of the internet is. And so I thought that it's very important this be treated as a controversy and it be taken up. And I hope my talk today will be a little bit of a contribution towards it. And the paper I did has more about this. And I would welcome people to read my paper. It's a draft version, and I would appreciate comments on it. But the reality of the internet, is that it's the result of scientific and technical collaboration that was international in its earliest stages. And it was also, there was a vision guiding the internet's development. And this vision inspired the international collaboration. And then thirdly, the internet is essentially the solution to a problem very different from the problem of creating a communication system to survive nuclear war. The internet is the solution to the problem of how do you create a network, a network of networks, a way to interconnect different networks. And that's the problem that was posed in 1973. Next slide. Okay, and I'm essentially not going back to the Barron myth. I'll take that up if we have time during questions. But I thought what's most helpful is to sort of look both at the problem on the table for the internet's development, and then also to look back a little further at what was going on, where the vision for the internet grew from. So if we look at the 1973, 74, and up to 83 period, essentially what happened is that there was a recognition, that there would be a set of international networks, that different countries would have networks, different entities might have networks, and that these networks would all be different, that there would be networks under different administrative and political administration and ownership, and that also that the technical nature of these networks would be different. And the problem was posed, how would you interconnect these different networks? How could you communicate across the boundaries of these different networks? And that problem essentially was identified, and one way of talking about it was to call it the multiple network problem. I think there were other ways of talking about it, but it was essentially a problem of having a number of different networks and being able to have something that could cross the boundaries of this, have a way to have communication cross the boundaries of these different networks. And essentially there was the desire to have a way to connect networks that were being developed in the early 1970s. Some of those networks included CCLAIDS in France, NPL in Great Britain, and ARPANET in the US. And that was a problem sort of put on the table, but it was a problem that politically couldn't be dealt with at the time. That there was not a way to take on that problem directly. So instead what happened is, the next overhead, is there was a way to set up an international research project. That project involved Norway, Great Britain, and the US. And that enabled the researchers in those different projects in those different countries to see if they could collaborate on work towards the protocol, which would be called TCP/IP, the Internet Protocol. And if you see here, this is very interesting. This overhead came from a book put out by a workshop in 1975 that was something called YASSER, which was in Luxembourg, Austria. And there were people from the East and West at this workshop. And one of the presentations made at this workshop was about the early research that was being done between the US, Great Britain, and Norway. And Peter Kirstein presented essentially the work being done. And you can see that there was ARPANET in the US, Northstar in Norway, and in London you had the UCL, the University College of London network. What I'd like to do is go back a little further, because as I was reading some of the technical literature that had been sent to me by some of the people who were networking people in in the early 70s, some of the people who'd worked at BB&N, they sent me some papers by J.C.R. Licklider. And I was very interested in these papers because they had an understanding and feeling for the nature of communication and the importance of communication. And they were, in some ways, both visionary and philosophical. And I sort of wondered where this work came from, because in general, I sort of had expected the papers to be sort of more narrowly technical papers. And what was fascinating was to kind of try to understand Licklider's background and to understand how he came to have this perspective about communication, which several people later on who did some of the technical work to develop and gave the leadership to the Internet's development or to the ARPANET's development, they said that they had been inspired by Licklider and his work. And so it seemed very important to understand a bit of Licklider's background. And what's helpful is that Licklider had, in the 1940s and 1950s, been part of a group of people, which was something called the Macy Foundation meetings. They were an interdisciplinary set of meetings, and they had people in them like Margaret Mead and Julian Bigelow and Norbert Wiener. They had people who were engineers, mathematicians, and anthropologists and psychologists. And these people met for about a 10-year period of time in the 1940s to 1950s, and they tried to figure out what was the science of communication. And they were scientists, so they didn't want to just have some theoretical idea. They also wanted to see if they could practice understanding the science of communication. A piece of their practice was to have a discussion across disciplines. And they realized their disciplines talked all different languages. But they wanted to see if they could understand what each different discipline would understand about communication, or whether they could inspire each other and help each other to understand the nature of communication and to apply it to their discipline. And some of their work was over something called feedback systems or self-organizing systems or cybernetics, and that was some of the particular study that they did. And what was interesting is the way they had their conferences was they tried to apply to the conference format the communication ideas they were learning. So the conferences would be over a weekend period of time. They'd have 2 or 3 presentations. The people who made the presentation would take questions as they were presenting on the particularity of the technical ideas they were talking about. But then afterwards they would have a discussion. They would transcribe the proceedings, and then they would publish the transcriptions of those proceedings. So there are 5 volumes of those publications now, and those publications then had been studied by, I thought, some of the people later in the 1960s and 1970s to sort of understand what some of the background ideas were that had given rise to a sort of broader view of communication and the ideas of information and control systems. The person that I was trying to understand more about, and that's Jay's talk will be about Licklider as well, is J.C.R. Licklider. And he liked people to call him Lick. He was a research scientist who had made scientific advances in communication research. You can go to the next one, I think. His PhD thesis was mapping how sound is perceived in the brain of the cat. And he actually put electrodes in the brain of the cat and tried to see where you would think that the aspects of sound would be perceived. So it was a real effort to apply science to the study of the brain. Essentially, this period of time was a time when there were people who were studying the brain who felt that if you studied computers, you could learn something about the brain. And there were people who were studying computers that felt if you learned something about the brain, you could understand more about computers. And so those 2 studies were very important, that there would be an interdisciplinary exchange and study of that. And Licklider got to present some of his research at one of the 10 Macy Foundation meetings on cybernetics. And then what's interesting is he then sponsored, next one, a conference in 1954. And at the conference, it was sponsored by the NSF. It was at MIT. And it had a range of people at it, like Norbert Wiener and a number of psychologists and a number of engineers. And you can see the discussion in this conference between the engineers and the psychologists, and trying to see if they could learn from each other to be able to understand how to do their research in a broader way. And what I find interesting is the Macy conferences ended, and here's this NSF conference, and it's a link between the Macy conferences and the work that then Licklider would go on to do. So I thought this is not only interesting in that way, but I thought Licklider's mechanisms of managing research proved to be very valuable and set a very high standard for the research, and I thought that that's had a very important long-term effect. And basically this was some of his training. He published a volume about the NSF conference that was just like the Macy conferences. It was a transcript, and you could see the discussion of what was going on. Okay, we can go to the next. Based on all of this, that if you then look at Licklider's papers, then it gives a better way to understand the papers. And there's a paper that he wrote in 1968 with Robert Taylor, but I met Robert Taylor, and he basically said that it was Licklider's paper. So, and it was about the nature of communication. And Jane will talk more, I thought, also about the paper. But the particular aspect of that paper that I'm interested in is where Licklider is of taking some of the brain research and applying it to the research that he's inspired and that's going to be developed. And the particular aspect of that is that in this paper, essentially what gets talked about is that there's a way of modeling that goes on in the brain that was Licklider's view of what happened. And he felt that that mechanism of modeling was very important to understand, and then to see if there was a way that what would be developed via the computer networks would be something that would be helpful with regard to that way of modeling. And what's interesting is that Licklider was a psychologist, so he was interested in the development of computers not only as somebody helping them to develop, but also very much with the perspective of the user in mind, and of himself as a user. And what was it that he wanted to see happen in terms of the scientific research and research community he was part of? And the particular thing he was interested in was to see if there would be a way of having collaborative work. And so, and also Licklider felt modeling was tremendously important. And so in this paper with Robert Taylor, what he writes is that by far the most numerous, most sophisticated, and most important models are those that reside in men's minds. And this is from the paper, The Computer as Communications Device. And an example of how the computer could represent modeling was something from the next one, that Licklider liked to give the example of Yvonne Sutherland. And Sutherland had produced a program called Sketchpad. And Sketchpad was a way to use the computer to create modeling programs. And one of Sutherland's, one of his graduate students at the time, you can go next, okay, gives this example that Sutherland sketched the girder of a bridge and indicated the points at which members were connected together by rivets. He drew a support at each end of the girder and a load at the center. The model showed the girder sagging under the load, and a number appeared on each member showing the tension there. So Sutherland was able to add the support needed for it to support the extra weight, and so this gave some idea of how, if you had systems and you had the computer, you could understand what was happening on one aspect of a system and make allowances for it in terms of providing what you needed. You can go to the next one. Licklider felt that modeling was not only critical for scientific research, but for society as well. And so describing the modeling that he felt was important in terms of the brain, what he said was in richness, plasticity, facility, and economy, the mental model has no peer, but in other respects it has shortcomings. Okay, and some of those shortcomings he felt was it can be observed and manipulated only by one person, and then society distrusts the modeling that comes from one person's brain. And so more specifically, what Licklider was interested in was to see if there would be possible a kind of cooperative modeling. And what he felt was that the computer communities that got developed were in fact a mechanism of this cooperative modeling. And what he writes is individual models can be compared and brought into some degree of accord. You can have cooperation in the construction, maintenance, and use of a model, a plastic or moldable medium that can be modeled, and a dynamic medium in which processes will flow into consequences, and that the computer networks will be a common medium that can be contributed to and experimented by all. And so he had a vision, I thought, that grew up from the time-sharing communities that he then applied to what he hoped would develop with the networking communities. And so that was a perspective. Based on this, what he pointed out was in richness, facility. Look at the next one. Sorry.
The next one's Brownian emotion.
Okay, so yeah, sorry. Based on this, there was also another conference in 1960, and at this conference, they had a number of computer pioneers that had been involved in the computer development of the 1940s to 1960s. And they were essentially trying to figure out what would be the problem of computer development. And at this meeting, they invited C.P. Snow to give a talk. And C.P. Snow is the British scientist. And what C.P. Snow talked about was that what had happened is that when you had scientists, and scientists were developing important computer developments, that essentially what was happening was that these computer developments were something that would make very big changes in society, and there would be people who wouldn't understand how to deal with these changes, especially government officials, who would be the people who would have to deal with these changes. And so what they essentially proposed was that you needed to have a way to have government officials have a way of dealing with what would be the consequences of these changes and having some way to deal with that. And what they basically proposed was that something like Brownian motion was what you needed. And what that meant is that you had to have discussion among all segments of society about the problem, and then about what might be a way to determine what might be a way to deal with the problem. And based on that, some idea could be sorted out, such as what had happened with healthcare in Great Britain after the war, that all segments of society were discussing it, and based on that, legislation was in fact created to have healthcare in Great Britain. So go to the next one. Licklider then went to the Information Processing Office at ARPA and set in motion a set of things that made it possible to do the research that has created very important changes. Okay, go to the next one. Okay, but Licklider had trouble also with the Department of Defense when they did put pressure on him to do things that were related to defense. Because essentially in the Department of Defense you could do research that was more general research, but that was also a contest, and at one point that got very difficult. And so Licklider wrote some articles about that, and what he said is you need the public, you can go to the next one, and the citizens to be active in trying to understand what the research was that was needed, and to be discussing and arguing and thinking about it, and out of that would come a way to put the pressure on the government situation like he was in, to have the appropriate research. We go down to the 1990s, and in the 1990s, what happens is there are many people online, and out of that comes the sense that there was research done by Michael Hauben, and some of that research was asking people what were they doing on the net, what did they find interesting about it, and he got many, many comments from people. And from those comments, what he was surprised about is people said not only that the internet was something important for them, but they wanted to spread the net, and they wanted to have it available to other people, and they wanted to participate in having it be something good for society. And so from that, he took the concept of net.citizen and made he sort of changed it to the term netizen, and put a paper online about that. Later, a book was published, and the term went out around the world. And what's interesting is many people consider themselves netizens. And Michael differentiated about netizens. He said essentially people that he called netizens were the people who felt people had to participate to make the net something good and to make the world something good. And that was in line with what Licklider had said and had recognized as needed. And what's interesting is if we go to, we look now, what's fascinating is South Korea is one of the places where there's the most broadband access in the world. And what's interesting is there are many people who call themselves netizens. And I was there this summer, and we asked people, are you a netizen? And people would say yes, or they would say, I hope so. So I thought the hope so was the sense that, in fact, the people had that understanding of the netizen as something very important and some way of participating in making changes in the society via their ability to participate about the net. And essentially, what Michael felt was that netizens, go back a minute, were that the participation was critical. And then if we just apply this to Tunis, that if you look at this perspective, that the internet gives you this moldable, plastic, collaborative environment, if there's a way that this can be part of the discussions about what's going on with getting access available to everybody and with figuring out a governance model that makes sense, then that would be a means that would be taking a new model rather than an old model to figure out how to deal with the future of the internet. And so I think from the history, you can get some better perspective, but also I thought that this means that the processes become much more online processes, and that the modeling perspective that helped to build the net be a perspective that be understood and be applied to the current problems.
Actually, we can have perhaps one or two questions, but then we should move on in the interest of time. Anybody want to raise a question or ask a comment or a question? Thank you. The next speaker is me, which will take a second.
Yeah, I'll take your turn, so I'll do your turn.
Yes.
You're going to do the overheads, or you want
I guess I can do it.
What?
I guess I can do it.
Okay, I'll just watch your time. Go ahead. Can you move that? Good.
Good. Hello. I'm honored to be here at this scientific conference and also to be in Tunis for the World Summit on the Information Society. I too believe that this is an important event, the success of which we will see or not see in a few days, but I think the questions on the table are important for the world. And so I'm glad there's a gathering to take them up, and the process is ongoing. The paper I have prepared is about the visions in 1945 and 1965 of the libraries of the future. I have copies here, and I'll be glad for people to take the copies, or you can see it online. You can't quite see it online. The end of that is...
DOC?
No.
jhauben.doc?
I don't know what it is. I guess
Okay.
it's yes. It's a Word document, so it's not DOC. The talk I'm going to give, or actually read, is the context in which Licklider did his work, which is I'm going to talk about Licklider's ideas about communication, similar to what Rhonda spoke to, and his sense of the computer and the computer-human relationship. And I hope that will put in context the paper, but I hope people will also read the paper. J.C.L. Licklider lived from 1915 to 1990, and he combined in his own background the career of fields of psychology and engineering. And the interesting combination is the psychology was the human mind and the engineering was the computer, and he was able to see them as similar and to make the connection between them. And so his whole work, his whole life's work seems to be looking for the similarity and the differences and the connections between computing, computers, networks, and the human mind and human society. A thread to his intellectual work is his search to understand and model the human brain. Licklider presented, I don't know if I have a graphic. Then Licklider presented his vision for an intergalactic network, as he called it, essentially in two seminal papers: the Man-Computer Symbiosis paper in 1960 and the Computer as a Communications Device in 1968 with Robert Taylor. Less well known, but also quite significant, is the book he wrote in 1965 called Libraries of the Future, which has been digitized and is available, and the paper gives the URL for that. Symbiosis, which was the topic of his first paper, is a living together in intimate cooperative association of two different organisms or species. And that's how Licklider saw the human-computer relationship developing. Licklider's vision was different from the computer becoming a servant for people or an extension of human abilities, and different from the long-range goal of artificial intelligence researchers that the computer would one day replace or supersede human thinking. Licklider was looking for the answer to the question posed by Norbert Wiener's theory of cybernetics. What role for humans and what role for machines in the future? Licklider predicted that in not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought and processed data in a way not approached by information handling machines we know today. Both human thinking and computer operation would evolve via the relationship between humans and computers. The computer would act more and more like a colleague, the interactions with which helps you think your thinking. Licklider envisioned that the computer partner, especially in a network, would facilitate finding needed information, processing it, diagnosing relevance, determining logical or dynamic consequences within the information. The human partner would initiate the task, define the criteria, evaluate the results so as to gain insights and make decisions. The human and his or her computer would become a thinking partnership. The human would be the dominant partner. Licklider foresaw that these individual thinking partnerships would be connected into a thinking center, similar to what we call a LAN or local area network today. He wrote, "It seems reasonable to envision," this was in 1960 he was writing, "for a 10 or 15 years hence, a thinking center that will incorporate the functions of present-day libraries together with anticipated advances in information storage and retrieval and the symbiotic functions suggested earlier in this paper." He then extended his vision and said, "This picture readily enlarges itself into a network of such centers, connected to one another by wideband communication lines and to individual users by leased wire services. In such a system, the speed of the computers would be balanced, and the cost of the gigantic memories and sophisticated programs would be divided by the number of users." He had in mind a computer utility, which would be a central mainframe large computer, and people would have terminals. That was before the invention of the PC, which gave us the computing power locally. Notice that Licklider anticipated that the cost of the internet he was predicting would be distributed among the users. The more universal the connectivity, the lower the cost per user. That in some ways is the secret of today's internet. The more sharing, the greater the efficiency, and the lower the necessary cost to everyone. Necessary, not the cost they actually pay, but the necessary cost, because there are other factors. Licklider was here foreseeing that the functions of present-day libraries in particular would more and more take place online. Just as he published this conception of the human-computer symbiosis in 1960, he was chosen to lead a project funded by the Ford Foundation to explore the libraries of the future he was predicting. The project was undertaken at Bolt, Beranek & Newman, an acoustic science and technology consulting firm near the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. BB&N later became famous for its role in designing and implementing the subnetwork of the US government's ARPANET project. Licklider gathered at BB&N a small team of engineers and psychologists, supplemented by some of his colleagues at MIT. And the main aspect of their understanding was that the whole body or corpus of recorded thought, at least in the sciences, law, medicine, technology, and the records of business and government, could sooner or later be digitized and then gathered into a single computer processable memory system, either local or distributed. The study was undertaken to answer the question, how might this whole corpus of recorded solid thought be organized and made accessible so that it would be attractive to use and a powerful lever for human progress? Licklider projected that if we found possible to process the body of recorded thought so as to have more direct access to its knowledge content, then there would be the basis of a new library system. Such a system would consist of memory storage terminals, computers, and networks that would make the body of human knowledge available for all possible human needs and purposes. Licklider chose the name Procognitive for the system that he was envisioning. Procognitive because it would be a system for the advancement and application of knowledge. There would be no transportation of books, just processing of information to knowledge and processing of queries and questions into answers, all done digitally. But how could information be processed into knowledge? How should the corpus of knowledge be organized? Like Vladimir Bush before him, Licklider looked to the brain. He recognized that the human brain is a complex arrangement of neuronal elements and processes. These elements and processes accept diverse stimuli, including spoken and printed sentences, and somehow process and store them in ways that support the drawing of inferences and the answering of questions. The human brain processes stimuli at the time of input, but does not store the stimuli. It stores a representation of them. The inferences and answers arrived at by the brain are not mere restatements of past inputs drawn from memory, but are tailored to be appropriate to the actual or current need. Licklider also believed in part that humans think by manipulating, modeling, combining schemata or schemes and models of how things work or relate to each other. New knowledge, he believed, is achieved by adapting one or more old schemata to fit new situations. Licklider's procognitive system would process the whole corpus of recorded thought and information in order to capture the semantic relations and content within the data across all discipline lines. Licklider expected that the system could then be addressed in natural language format. The scholar and other users would receive natural language knowledge responses to their queries and searches. They would still, however, have to read and think and generate insights and make discoveries beyond what the system provides. The system would provide semantic-like concepts and answers, but the human would make the final and meaningful interpretation. Thus, the humans could contribute back into the system in an ever-expanding symbiosis. For Licklider, the library of the future would be a powerful man-machine knowledge system, but it could only come to be if the socio-political questions were answered constructively. And what he saw those questions were, would society set itself the goal of developing intellectual and scholarly resources to the extent he envisioned? Would all the holders of digitized information share their holdings without restriction? Would society resist the commercial pressure to keep knowledge proprietary? He was an optimist, but he thought these obstacles would take a long time to overcome. In the middle of doing this work on the Libraries of the Future project, Licklider took a leave of absence from BB&N to join the Advanced Research Projects Agency. He had been recruited to take over the oversight and funding of computer and psychological research. He convinced the ARPA management that given a free hand to fund interactive computing, he would satisfy with whatever obligations they felt he was under. Licklider started up the Information Processing Techniques Office that funded and gave leadership in the 1960s and 1970s to the ARPANET and Internet projects. But it was too soon during his tenure from 1962 to 64 for either the symbiosis or the libraries of the future he predicted to be achieved. In 1968, a year before the setup of the first nodes of the ARPANET packing switching network experiment, Licklider, working with Robert Taylor, projected how computing network would expand human activity. Licklider and Taylor summarized their thinking in the article, The Computer as a Communications Device. In it, they investigate the implications of Norbert Wiener's insight that computers are communication devices. Communication is fundamental to social animals like humans. An additional means of communication can have a profound effect. Licklider and Taylor looked for how the computer will help people do more than send and receive data. Their emphasis always was deliberately on people-to-people communication, as opposed to the engineering practice of transferring information from one point to another. Licklider and Taylor argued that when information transmission and information processing are combined and available on networks of computers, cooperation, collaboration, and coherence are much more likely to occur than among isolated researchers. Human creativity would increase and the accumulation of knowledge would accelerate. They wrote, when minds interact, new ideas emerge. The computer as a communication device can, they wrote, change the nature and value of communication even more profoundly than the printing press and the picture tube. For a well-programmed computer can provide direct access both to informational resources and to the process for making use of those resources. By making possible quality transmission and processing of information among geographically separated people, they would follow the creation of communities not of common location, but based on commonality of interest. That would be a great boon to the fullness of life. Those communities of common interest can be seen today in the myriad of online groups and new social dynamics generated by online activity and by the active search by netizens to affect politics in their societies. Licklider and Taylor foresaw that the interconnection of computers as communication devices leads to a much broader class of connections. The collection of people, hardware, and software, the multiple access computer, together with its local community of users, will become a node in a geographically distributed computer network, they wrote. Then all the large computers, thank you, don't worry. Then all the large computers can communicate with one another, and through them all the members of the super community can communicate with other people, with programs, with data, or with a selected combination of these resources. Licklider and Taylor saw great benefit to society as a result of the communication revolution made possible by the digital computer and the global computer network, but they included in their writing a warning. They wrote, for the society, the impact will be good or bad, depending mainly on the question, will to be online be a privilege or a right? If only a favored segment of the population gets a chance to enjoy the advantage of intelligence amplification, the network may exaggerate the discontinuity in the spectrum of intellectual opportunity. The basic question they raise is that of access. The great advantage to society of the computer networks would only be achieved if access is a right. That is, if governments ensure that no sector of society is being left out and ensure that no sector of the online world is blocked. The positive effect of networking would only be enjoyed if using the network was made easy, affordable, and interactive. Isn't that the essence, though, of the challenge here in Tunis this week? WSIS will be a success if the governments if the governments of the world can agree on a commitment to full, affordable, or free online access as a right for all people. It is hard to expect this agreement from this summit, but I think that's because the public and the online communities have not been involved in the heart of the process. And so I'd like to end on an optimistic note. If the WSIS process succeeds in arriving at such an agreement, or if the motion towards such an agreement is in process, then the process should continue by looking for ways to involve the public more and the online communities more, so as to better understand and safeguard this right. Licklider and Taylor conclude, if the network idea should prove to do for education what a few have envisioned in hope, if not in concrete detailed plan, and if all minds should prove to be responsive, surely the boon to mankind would be beyond measure. Despite all the problems with the WSIS process, I end my talk with this upbeat sentiment and ask for your comments and opinions and questions, if any. Thank you.
Any questions? We can have time for 1 or 2 questions. Yeah.
Certainly an interesting figure. The way you approach it, though, concerns me a little bit. I mean, Licklider is sort of, you look back in the time and you pluck out this one figure who has a set of values that comport with our sort of present notions of what constitutes good information practice. What were the countervailing views? Did Licklider have critics, opposing points of view? What was the nature of the discussion at that time of the ideas that he was presenting?
He was such an optimist and enthusiast that he just pushed forward and threw them out and put them into the pot of the discussion. There were many people that saw things very narrowly and technically and felt that it was for the scientific community, and it was bound by the technical possibilities. And his idea was, it's grander than that, it's bigger than that. You're looking too narrowly. So his debate was out of his enthusiasm and out of the conviction he carried of having experienced it himself. He played at a terminal for hours and hours, one of the first ever to do interactive computing with the mini computers. And he took it almost as a religion. So his influence was not because he entered the debates particularly, but because what he said rang true to the young graduate students who were around, and he had hold of the purse strings. When he went to offer, he had $7 million, which he sprinkled around. They called him Johnny Appleseed. He would go and he would say, if you're going to do interactive computing, and if you sense in this vision something you're interested in, I'll fund you. And that's a very strong incentive for people to take seriously the vision he was putting forward. But in that process, the young graduate students became enthusiasts themselves, and they became the foundation of the network community within the United States, at least. And they were not limited to the United States, and they made their contacts around the rest of the world. So I appreciate your question. I didn't contextualize. I don't take up the debates, but I do find in what he put forward the inspiration of a number of people who credit him. If you go back to the literature and you ask people, where did your ideas come from? Where did you first get this sense? Often they say it was Licklider in his talk or his lecture or his this or that. So it's not out of the debate, particularly that he functioned. He was somewhere in the clouds in a lot of ways, but it was helpful to that community.
Does this the concept to be online originates then and there in 1968, or is it?
I don't know.
Well, I thought that was already from the time-sharing communities.
Yeah,
so he had observed the time-sharing communities. So the time-sharing communities were developed from when he went to ARPA in 1962. He funded time-sharing projects. Each of those was a single computer community, but they were an online community. And then he had the sense, can you connect these different communities? That's where the ARPANET idea came from. But there was already an online from the big time-sharing.
And they had the equivalent of email and user groups and
collaborative activity, yeah.
And another question I was thinking about, you said...
We should just 2 more minutes.
Yeah, you said something like the public should be involved in making future decisions. Public should be more involved, like in summits like the WSIS. I was thinking, does the public actually want to be involved, or do they just want to do their own thing on the internet, communicate with friends, and do they actually want to be involved in decisions about the future of the internet or communication? Should
we put that as a
grand question.
The grand question, and just that's where the netizen concept comes from.
So
the 1990s, the people did want to be involved, and in Korea, some of the whole sense is a participatory democracy, that the people online, there's a whole set of people who want to participate. And maybe after Killam's talk, you can talk a little bit what's happening there, where it's very clear people want to be involved. But that's what Michael found. People did want to be involved in decisions. So there's a segment of the online community, and that's ability to spread it is possible.
Well, I've done some research on my own, and I see maybe in different fields, I see an opposite.
Okay, so that's why we should bring that up for the end.
And we should have it as a discussion, not as an answer to your question.
Yeah, that's fair. And just quickly, can we just hear her question, and then we should take it up afterwards, or is it she?
I'll put it out there. Yeah, what I think is interesting about Licklider is that he thought man-computer symbiosis would be temporary and eventually the computer would take over, be the dominant partner. But my question
In
is
500
actually,
years.
my question is actually about citizenship, and online rights, which both of you brought up, because citizens have responsibilities to make society better, but they also have some guaranteed rights, and it seems that online you can voluntarily say, I'm going to be a netizen, I'm going to take responsibility, but I wonder about the rights aspect, because what rights are you guaranteed online, and what would be the mechanism for ensuring people have rights? You mentioned access, but is that the extent that you have the right to access, but then you don't necessarily have the right to governance or free speech or other rights that we associate with citizenship online? And perhaps to think about if we thought people should have those type of rights, how would you need to go about politically or otherwise negotiating that?
Okay, can we combine that in the end with his question, which says, do people want that? And your question is, what is it that is in that situation?
He's going to set up. Do you want to just say your question, and then while he's setting up, and he should set
I
up?
have a very simple question. It is very interesting to listen to you about these pioneers in the internet research. But I wonder whether the Licklider and his colleagues have foreseen the existence of quite a number of netizens, also netizens, but those netizens are not trying to make internet a resource for study for the benefit of the society, but make the internet a tool for making illegal money. They send all kinds of malicious messages and so on to make money illegal way. And this is threatening the internet to be such a nice
Yeah, well,
place.
Michael didn't call those people netizens. Now the media calls those people netizens as well. So there's a problem there. He would call those people users, not netizens. Netizens have the context of citizenship. Are you ready to start? Yes, so we should.
Very difficult to separate those kinds of people.
But that maybe we should put that as part of our final
Online
question.
and so on.
Great.
They call themselves netizens also.
Okay. We should just, okay, the next talk is Werner Zollern, and he's going to, wait, I'm sorry, what is it, probably? You'll have to shut it. You can't shut it because it doesn't, but this does, but the laptop won't go back on.
Just cover it if you want.
Cover it.
You
You cover it, you have something to cover it?
It's covered.
Okay, I need to, you'll give him the time?
Clap it down.
Okay, yes,
So,
okay, the
thank
floor is
you.
yours,
Yeah.
yes.
So
And from Germany.
to this time, I thank Rhonda and Jay for having been motivated to come here. I thank you for coming here to listen. And I'm going to talk about a very early stage of computer networking when we set up the first computer connection to China. And for the younger ones of you, also the older ones, I invite you to a time journey to go back into the early 80s. And this genealogically I did for a project before I was invited here. And you see, we started with our email services in 1984, and the beginning of open networking could be really fixed to somewhat 83, and this was a very early stage when three big movements, or differently movements of different size. One was the OSI movement of setting up open standards, a big thing from CCITT, which is now part of the ITU. All the manufacturers and all the standardization organization behind, so the big power. The second one, a relatively tiny one, was the TCP/IP fraction associated with the names Windsurf, Bob Kahn. And the third one, which is normally not considered, were the network providers, so to say the computing centers in the university and others which want to connect to each other. And the third group was is associated with the name Larry Landweber. He brought the people together. And at that time, there exist big computer networks from the vendors, from IBM, BitNet was one, from TechNet, huge computer networks, from the Unix Society, UECP, and the Commercial Things, TimeNet, and Multics, and so on. So the only thing was that these networks did not cooperate. And the only service which was slightly to, or could be implemented first, was the electronic mail service, out of quite a lot of reasons. And when we started in that very early stage, we decided to enter the CSNet community, which offered one open standard in the sense that they distributed their protocols to everyone who was invited. And so that was our the milestone in 1984. And what I'm going to talk about is not the main tree, that is a German thing, but that branch here on that side, let me see here, which finally led to CANet. And so what we did, and that maybe some sample project we learned from what we did nationally and internationally, and transferred it to developing side countries, not only China but also Vietnam, and so we were in some sense a mediator. So we did not only one thing but also passed knowledge to good friends within corporations. And so I'm going to tell you a few things which are also thanks to, especially Jay Hauben, who is a very, very diligent journalist who asks everything 3 and 4 times to get evidences. And so it's an interesting thing that if you look into the web and look what is written about that early stage, what I'm going to talk about, between 1983 and 1991, and a little bit further, but the main milestones were set in that time. The rest was, so to say, scaling and expansions. This history is, so far as I can, it considers our project mainly wrong. So the facts is really put either in the wrong order. CANet, the Chinese Academic Network, was founded after we sent the first email, not before. Why should they set up a network without having any international service? The man who is shown and mentioned most is Tian Bai. He was not even part of our project. He entered it in the last minute, but later is mentioned to be the guy who has done everything. And the most important fact, which is not shown in none of those timelines, is the approval of that network connection, or of China as a whole, by the National Science Foundation in November 1987. That was for me the most important milestone in connecting China, because without that permission, the whole traffic would be filtered and blocked. And we must really think back what it means, 1980 and time journey back. Big computer installations already there, but no open communication, no safe or reliable international telecom services for digital data transmission, except a few islands or lease lines. So the islands did not work. And the leased lines is prohibitive for test phases and things like that. So the only thing what really to start is modem and bad telephone lines. And if you at that time, early 80s, think, make tests over dirty telephone lines between Germany and China, you can imagine what the conditions might be. So if I put the timeline, so I don't want to bore you with all the contents inside, but you see here, so this 1982 is really, in some sense, the starting point for many, many projects of that time. And so we were early birds in that sense. And so the first event is worthwhile mentioning, a conference being held in Beijing. And to summarize these different things a little bit, to make it more recognizable, is one thing is motivate people, second thing is get funding, third thing is get technology, or get the technique being implemented, and until the first famous first email, and then get the international approval, and then next step is to roll out the network services within China. So to attach the time needed, so motivation was done in 45 minutes, so to say, through a lecture I gave in that first conference, and the people said, don't talk, don't gossip or something like that, do something for us. And so that was the original. As Larry Landweber, he confessed on his last visit, he never threw away anything, so do I. So I kept my original thoughts. As bad as such thing, we did not know, nobody could read. Translation was terrible. So 1983. But the people say, now don't tell something and disappear, do something. So that was not the main motivator. And people were very nice all together. So, and this, I want to show a few people. So the main, I always say, soul and heart of the project on the Chinese side was Professor Wang, and I say a few words. His life is exceptional. He studied in Germany. He was in Berlin in 1945. You can imagine, as a Chinese in 1945 in Berlin. He stayed there. He married a German, had 3 kids. Then followed Zhou Enlai's call to China, built up in 1950, went with his 3 children to China, and then the family broke, and he, in the Cultural Revolution, he was sent to prison for to far countryside for 6 years and then returned. And he is born in 1911, so he was the oldest of all, but has the most power to really pursue the things and everything. And I was a project leader from, so to say, from the German, but also from the international side. So whatever I did, he took care that the resources and everything was done. So without his help, nothing would have been possible. I could have suggested everything. So, and the photo here, the picture on the right side, I will come back in a minute. And so, first thing is, I show this is a quick sequence of slides. I convinced our Prime Minister of the province Baden-Württemberg, Lothar Späth, who was a fan of Chinese cooperation, to spend in now it's currency 130,000 euros, and we bought a wax machine, which we call China Wax. This was in 1985, and allowed us to. The second thing is also original, is to set up technical-wise the end-to-end connection, and you really must think nothing was there except telephone lines at the end and 2 X25 islands between one in Italy, one in Beijing, which we have first to let's speak to each other, and the rest from the application level down to the lower level has to be implemented, programmed. And at the time where communistic things still were absolutely the threat for the Americans, COCOM was valid, no export American technology, and. So we decided to implement the CSNet software on the Siemens computers in order to be free of this kind of problems, of embargo and these things. This took us from 1985 till 1987, so it's the longest period. We did not work the whole time, but it took as long. And the final thing was then really happening in September 1987, and it was really Rhonda and Jay who motivated to translate my old publication on that, which is the utmost detail I have ever written. So every little tiny thing is really described, and I put it into an English translation, and for those who are interested, I have a copy here. So and later on it will appear on the net, you can read it. So it's really interesting to see with what kind of problems we struggled those days. And so the first mail, the first famous mail, I copied it out of my mail directory, is that one. And even the guys who named Jian Bai should have had a short look into that mail, because everyone who was part of the project, even the tiniest operator was mentioned. And okay. But that has something to do with history of technology, by the way, that things are published, but in a small magazine, and nobody reads it. Yeah, a small thing, 1988, written in German, somewhere 600 copies. Nobody's aware. So we have a new time, and then I will put it in the network and then see what comes out.
Can you just show the header? Pull down the graphics. So.
Okay, so the header. And so, okay, this could be, we have not too much time, but that's the thing. And now the main thing was really to get that approval from the National Science Foundation. You see, if you read the text here, the chairman for CSNet, Dave Faber, Ira Fuchs for the BitNet side. The extension of BitNet and CSNet electronic mail to China is a natural enlargement of telephone and postal services to increase the possibilities of cooperation and so on. This means this was an approval for all networking projects and services later on, restricted to electronic mail, not only for ours.